as we're mechanizing meat production, we wake up and say, oh, I know how to make all this clean and profitable and get all the food out to millions of people. It takes time, and markets have to develop, and it's not instantaneous. These things have to be worked out. And yes, I'm sure there was an ugly period in meat manufacturing. None of us would have, I mean, to this day I wouldn't want to walk into a factory where they slaughter cows and chop up the meat. And, I mean, it looks pretty yucky. It has to be done though. And I'm sure there was a phase in which it was much dirtier than it is today. But the fact is that capitalism makes things cleaner and better. Why? Because if not, a competitor will make it better and cleaner, and I, as a consumer of that meat, don't want fingers in my meat. So I will just boycott the people who have fingers in their meat and go with the people who have clean meat. And that's true of all products. I mean, why don't, you know, it takes time. Airplanes, when they first took off, there were more accidents. What a shock to new technology, right? If today, the standards of safety that we have today were imposed on the early airplane business, there would be no airplanes. It's just impossible. See, you know, and again, we live in a wealthy society in which we think, snap, whatever we feel like is just there. You know, we know the standards, and it just has to be clean, it has to be good, it has to be cheap, it has to be no children, it has to be no fingers, or whatever. And it's just, life doesn't work that way. You know, just go to a third world country or a developing country that's coming into capitalism, and you see it. You see how life was horrific beforehand. It's still pretty ugly from our perspective, but it's moving in a certain direction. And it has to go through that. There's no the shortcut is, and this is what China and Thailand and Cambodia and all these countries are benefiting. The shortcut is our experience, our capital, our technology. The fact that we did it 100 years ago makes it possible for China to do it so much faster than what we had to do. Because we provide them with the capital, we provide them with the technology through investment, right? So we're huge beneficiaries if it was and the more free we are, the more we would be of that. So, you know, we could go on about monopolies and all that, but you get the drift. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned how that capitalism will naturally make things cleaner and better, etc., and that you advocate for a total separation of state and economy. Going along with the previous example of not necessarily fingers and meat, but in general, what about the cases where the consumer isn't entirely privy to information about how their product is created or what might be in it? For example, I could be sold fish from some fish salesman that has mercury in it for years at a time, and I'm not going to know that it had mercury in it until I'm the one dying of mercury poisoning.
Yeah. So there's a certain asymmetry of information here, right?
Right.
The producer has more information than you as a consumer has, and you know, what do you do? Right? So yeah, early on in capitalism, I think there's not much to do. You know, you just live with it, right? It's still better than what you had before. But at some point, well, I mean, you guys, there's a bunch of potential entrepreneurs here. Anybody can think of a way to make money off of this asymmetry of information? How about starting some kind of consumer testing thing and charging money for the information, maybe putting out a magazine where you rank meats or fish or whatever? I mean, the market and we as individuals are amazingly innovative when it comes to asymmetries of information. Right? That's exactly where there's money to be made. Where if somebody wants to know something and doesn't know how to get the information, well, here's an opportunity for me to provide you with that information, and I can make a buck off of it. So the market solves these problems. And yes, you know, people who, in the 1950s, everybody was using asbestos. Asbestos was considered the best product in the world. And nobody had a clue that there was anything wrong with it. They didn't. It's only in the 60s that people start suspecting stuff. And only in the 70s did they really have hard proof. And people who used asbestos in the 50s suffered. Life is rough sometimes. You know, what can you do? There's bad luck. But it's nobody's fault. It was the best information everybody had at the time. And as information came out, people figured it out. And there were lawsuits and there were ways to stop it. But, you know, I don't think the lawsuits were justified in suing somebody for lack of when they couldn't know. But if they were still using it when they knew that it was harmful and weren't telling anybody, lawsuits and stops using asbestos because it's not good for you, if it's not good for you, assuming that's all true. So there are mechanisms in which the court system is a mechanism. There are mechanisms capitalism deals with these things.
Quick follow-up.
Quick follow-up.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up?
Sure.
If the person selling the fish with the mercury in it knew that the fish had mercury in it, would that be immoral or illegal under a capitalist system?
It depends. It depends on how much mercury, right? Because there's small quantities of mercury, it's not clear that harmful to you. If it's clearly dangerous, and there's no question about it, yeah, and that's the court system would have to figure that out. That is, you would sue the fish merchant at some point, or somebody would sue them for having mercury in the fish, and the courts would evaluate whether there was a real risk here, a real threat to your life, and if there's a real threat, they would have to pay damages. And ultimately, you know, if it's poison, if it's defined as poison, yeah, they're killing you. You don't have a right to sell poison in the guise of fish. So that's fraud. Right? So, but again, you have to gain the knowledge of these things. Nobody knew 100 years ago that mercury was bad for you. Maybe they did, I don't know. But assume at some point people had to figure that out. And once you figure it out, you stop it because it's wrong to sell one thing in the guise of another. That's fraud. Yeah.
Can you please comment on Keynesian economic policy for me?
Comment on Keynesian economic policy. You know, where do you start? I think it's wrong from beginning to end, pretty much. And it's amazing because it died at some point. The peak influence of Keynes was, the early 1970s, when Richard Nixon, I think in 72 or 73, famously said, "We're all Keynesians now."
August 15th, 1971.
1971, thank you. We're all Keynesian now. And went ahead and implemented Keynesian economics. And what we got were the roaring 70s of high inflation and high unemployment, which Keynes said couldn't happen. Right? And by the early 1980s, it was pretty much accepted among many economists, if not a majority, that Keynes just got it wrong. And, you know, you really saw a shift in economic department, starting in the 1980s, away from Keynes, more towards, you know, Milton Friedman and monetarism and, you know, moderate forms of that. But some understanding of you know, that you can't, that the economy is not stimulated by government. The production doesn't occur because government spends money. And that there is a cost to deficits. And there's a cost to printing money. That these are not costless. And that all the liquidity traps and all this stuff that Keynes talked about is all just nonsense. Just nonsense. And, you know, you go back into the 30s and you look at the 30s and you look at what happened in the 30s as Milton Friedman did in a famous study, and the Austrians had done even before that. And the Austrians and Friedman disagree. But on one fundamental they all agree, and that is that Keynes is wrong. And they show it. So Keynes has been completely reputed. I mean, look at Japan over the last 20 years. Yeah. Right, Japan went in, its economy had a bubble, a typical, what the Austrians would call a typical bubble. They had a bubble in the late 80s that crashed in the early 90s. And what was the government's response? Keynes 101. Huge deficits, massive government spending. Nothing happened. So everybody said, including Paul Krugman, oh, they're not spending enough. They need to inflate more. So they spend more, and nothing happened. And to this day, the Japanese economy is flat. For 20 years, it's been flat. Nothing has happened. In spite of the practicing Keynesianism to the letter, they cannot get that economy going back. Now, we in America look at all that economic history and say, okay, we're going to try it, this time we'll be successful. We tried 100 times, always failed, but this time, why? And that to me is a fascinating question. Because, you know, I've come to believe that people do not learn anything from experience. They don't. They make the same mistake over and over and over again.